I absolutely love recounting the genesis of negative pressure wound therapy in the United States. It was October 31st, 1985. So let me just tell you now about these very first patients, because it was fascinating and it was fun and it was so successful. So this is LD, and he came to us from another hospital. Don't always these complications come from some other hospital. And the nurses called about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and they said, please come, we're desperate. This patient's wound is open down the midline, and there seems to be drainage. It looks like it's from the intestines. It looks feculent. It doesn't smell good either. And the patient's skin is just in terrible shape. And I looked and I looked and I got a syringe and I squirted normal saline on it, and I was trying to make sense of what it was that we were all dealing with and trying to fix. And so as I did that, I then decided that what I needed to do was contain this drainage. I wanted to contain the drainage. And they needed me. They wanted me there to help them, but I also was in the way. So I wanted to hurry to get this done, but there was going to be no hurrying. This ended up taking 5 hours, but it was worth every minute of time, and lots of trips downstairs to materials management and back up again. So what I ended up with was a Jackson Pratt going down the midline wound that was open, and another Jackson Pratt going across the base of the wound, and moist gauze, because, you see, moist wound healing was about a decade old by then, and we all knew that if you could keep a wound moist, that you would really enhance healing. So after we put the Jackson Pratts in, then we had a Y connector, and then the transparent film dressing, and then the stomaadhesive paste to close the gaps, and then the pink tape. And so many nurses, certainly so many WOC nurses, know the value and the importance of pink tape in our lives. So about midnight, the job was finished. The wound dressing had sucked up after we had connected it to wall suction, and I felt truly successful. So this is a rendering of what it looked like. You can see the transparent film dressing, and you can see the frame of pink tape. And we hooked it up to wall suction because that's what we had, and it was going to be continuous wall suction. We certainly were not sophisticated enough in those days to debate whether suction should be continuous or intermittent. And we used whatever pressure we needed to achieve the result we wanted, which was to contain the drainage and keep the transparent film sucked up against the skin. So in this case, it was about 60 millimeters of mercury, and that seemed to be just fine. Well, on day 2, when I came back, the dressing was still intact, and I was so thrilled. And I can tell you, the nurses were too, and so were the residents and the attendings. But I asked them, could you please take out a couple of these retention sutures? So indeed, they took out 4. And as they took these 4 retention sutures out, it was obvious that the skin had improved and I could clean the skin better. And it was obvious that it was going to be much easier to reinstall the dressing that I had done the night before with just 9 retention sutures instead of 13. So I had the opportunity, as I worked with LD over these days, from the first day to the 8th day, I had the opportunity to stroke his arm and to clean his abdomen and to see the skin heal and to comfort him in every way. And that's something that is just such a privilege for a caregiver to do, whether it's the physician, the nurse, the physical therapist, whoever it is. It's such a privilege to give comfort to someone who is so sick and hurting so badly. So look at what we accomplished in just 8 days. This gentleman's fistulas had closed and his wound was contracting and granulating from the base up. It was simply amazing. And I would go out in the hall and I would find physicians, surgeons, residents. And I'd say, you won't believe this. Please come look. And they were amazed too, but not as amazed as I was, because they don't look at granulation tissue like wound care nurses do, and they don't see the dramatic results of just a day or two of granulation tissue. But they were delighted, and they were impressed that the fistulas had closed. Now, this is a month later, and what is so remarkable about looking at LD's abdomen now is that this incision that has closed is a tight incision. You would expect for someone with such a gaping defect of a dehisced wound, you would expect a wide scar that probably would herniate in another, 6 months or a year. Interestingly, we were able to follow our first 5 patients, and none of them had any type of a herniation of their scar. And that was very exciting. So this was patient number 1, and we were on the lookout for anybody else that might need this particular type of procedure. And it wasn't long before the ICU called and said, can you come and do for this patient what you did for the patient across the hall? So this is Rachel, and you can see from these dressings the purulent, feculent material that was coming out of this wound. It was awful. Imagine the odor. Just imagine for the staff and for the patient herself to lie there with this kind of aroma coming up under her nose. And then, of course, the damage that this feculent material was going to do to her skin if we left it there, and the number of dressing changes that she was going to require. Just unthinkable. So down to material services I went to get the Jackson Pratt, the gauze, the normal saline, and everything that we needed to recreate this negative pressure wound therapy, which we called closed suction wound drainage. But this was Rachel, and oh my goodness, what a challenge she was. But here are the materials. You see the transparent film dressing, the stomaadhesive paste that we used for caulking, the Jackson Pratt, oh, it was so soft and so flexible, the pink tape, the skin sealant, always have to have that skin sealant, under a transparent film dressing, the gauze, and the saline. So we lined the wound bed with the 1 layer of gauze, so this didn't impede our suction, didn't obstruct any of the little bitty fenestrations. And then we packed the wound with some more moist gauze. We didn't pack it tight, we just packed it a little bit. Then the transparent film, and then the pink tape, of course, to close it, and then hooked it up to wall suction and watched this amazing contraction of the dressing. And we knew we were in business. We knew we had a seal, and we knew that the patient was going to be comfortable and that the nurses could get on about their business of caring for all of the rest of this patient's demands. It was something. And so we had, look at this, unexpected healing and just such impressive contraction of the wound and the granulation from the wound bed. I tend to be a bit of a purist about things like this, and I could stand up and say from the podium, look at this wound, how much faster it's healing. But how much faster than what? There was no way. I certainly wasn't going to be able to go to an institutional review board and say, I have a suggestion for some research. We're going to divide every patient's wound in half, and we will treat 1/2 in the conventional way and the other half with negative pressure, and then we'll compare. And that research really still hasn't been done, and oh, would I love to see it done in some way. So this was the procedure that you can see, and we always cut the Jackson Pratt to fit the wound, and then line the wound bed, and the gauze is always slightly moist, not wet, but slightly moist in the moist wound healing way of doing things. And then, of course, the skin prep to protect the skin from the transparent film dressing and also make it easier to release when it was time to change the dressing. And then making an airtight seal when the Jackson Pratt tubing came out to be connected to the wall suction. This is yet another patient, and I want you just to look at that wound. And look how that wound has contracted, and I think you can see that this is an obese patient. You're looking at her breasts above and then her pubis below, and I think you can appreciate the size of her abdomen. So that wound defect is under a great deal of tension, and it's so important that we be able to keep it closed and keep it healing as fast as possible so that we don't have the terrible defects that you see often from dehisced wounds. And this was Pamela, and Pamela was our biggest challenge and probably our greatest success. Pamela had had a colostomy and a urostomy. You can see those pouches in the picture. And then her entire midline wound had dehisced. And she had the 6 Penrose drains and exposed sutures. And she had some fistula drainage from under one of those Penrose drains. Just a challenge to end all challenges. Now, Pamela was not in the ICU. She was on a surgical floor, and the nurses were fit to be tied, and they were desperate for help. The surgeon was a bit dubious about what we were recommending, but he said, actually, whatever you can do to help, I certainly would appreciate it. So we did the same thing. We lined the wound bed with moist gauze. We folded the Penrose drains over that. We put the Jackson Pratt down the entire wound, and we had her all sealed up so that the colostomy pouch would stay intact, the urostomy pouch would stay intact, and her wound drainage would be collected, and we would know how much it was and when it stopped, and we were so delighted that it did. All of the fistulas in these patients did close while we were using the negative pressure wound therapy. So looky there, from February to May, and look at that wound, just an amazing closure. Well, as I said, gosh, I might have had a patent for something like this, but I didn't. And the main reason that I didn't was because I was brought up in the medical field by an amazing surgeon who believed that we all had the obligation to tell every clinician as soon as we could about advances that we had made, about devices that we had figured out, about procedures that we had perfected and that were not yet in the literature. So I can promise you, you saw that LD was in the hospital on Halloween night in 1985. I can tell you that by November the 15th, I was showing his slides at an educational seminar. At that time, in late 1985, one of the therapeutic bed companies was hosting seminars all around the country on wound care, and I was so honored to be part of that faculty. So with every patient, I got to show more slides about this procedure and encourage wound care nurses and physical therapists who were doing wound care and surgeons to try this procedure and see if they didn't get the same therapeutic results that we did. And so this was all public knowledge and in the public domain, as the attorneys would say, from that night in October all the way till we saw it come to market and change the world of wound care. Closed suction has so many benefits. Negative pressure has so many benefits. You know, the thing is that as I go to scientific meetings, and I still do go occasionally, I want to stay a little bit up with the technology. I don't think any of us really understand the science of what negative pressure wound therapy achieves. Is it that the wound is constantly moist? Is it that we have eliminated bacterial overload? Is it that we're sucking up these tissues to a certain extent and so we're increasing the blood flow? Just what is the mechanism of the wound healing? But nobody can argue that the wounds do heal. It's an amazing thing. Could we ever divide some wounds in half to compare? Or must we just stand up with confidence and say, the wounds heal faster? I don't know the answer to that. I challenge everybody watching this video. Don't you want to be the researcher to do that? So, as I said in the beginning, this has been a joyful 34 years of watching wound care take on a whole new dimension, not only with negative pressure, but in every other way, with calcium alginates, with all sorts of products, and with clinicians becoming more and more sophisticated and more curious all the time. It's been a privilege and it's been a joy. It's also fun for me to say, why don't you go out and think of what you could do to improve patient care, to make the patient more comfortable, and to advance medical science? What an opportunity. Go for it.